On April 12, 1945, Vice President Harry Truman received an urgent summons to the White House. When he arrived, Eleanor Roosevelt met him with devastating news. President Franklin Roosevelt was dead. Truman, stunned, asked Mrs. Roosevelt if there was anything he could do for her. She replied with words that captured the gravity of the moment. "Is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now." Truman had served as vice president for just 82 days. During that brief time, Roosevelt had barely included him in the inner workings of government. Truman hadn't been told about the Manhattan Project. He hadn't attended the major wartime conferences. He wasn't part of Roosevelt's tight circle of advisors. Now, suddenly, he was President of the United States, leading a nation still at war on two fronts, with decisions of world-changing importance demanding immediate attention. The next day, speaking to reporters, Truman's anxiety was palpable. "Boys, if you ever pray, pray for me now," he said. "I don't know if you fellas ever had a load of hay fall on you, but when they told me what happened yesterday, I felt like the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me." It was an honest admission from a man who understood the enormous shoes he had to fill. Franklin Roosevelt had been president for 12 years, guiding America through the Great Depression and most of World War II. His cabinet members were seasoned officials who had shaped the New Deal and managed the war effort. They were Roosevelt's people, chosen for their loyalty to him and their commitment to his vision. Truman faced an immediate dilemma. Should he keep Roosevelt's cabinet in place, maintaining continuity during a critical time, or should he gradually replace them with his own team? The answer, as it turned out, was the latter. But Truman was smart enough not to make wholesale changes overnight. On his first day in office, he asked all of Roosevelt's cabinet members to remain at their posts. He needed time to learn the job, to understand the challenges, and to identify who among Roosevelt's appointees could work with him effectively. The American people needed reassurance that the government would continue functioning smoothly despite the shocking loss of their president. But behind this public display of continuity, Truman was already assessing each cabinet member. Who shared his priorities? Who would be loyal to him rather than to Roosevelt's memory? Who had the skills needed for the difficult post-war transition ahead? Within weeks, the first departures began. The earliest change came in the State Department. Edward Stettinius Jr. had been Roosevelt's Secretary of State for just over a year. A businessman from General Motors and U.S. Steel, Stettinius had accompanied Roosevelt to the Yalta Conference in February 1945, where the Allied leaders met with Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin. But Truman had doubts about Stettinius. The new president thought Stettinius had been too soft on communism at Yalta, yielding too much to Moscow's demands. More importantly, Truman wanted his own person in this crucial position, someone he knew and trusted from his Senate days. That person was James Burns, a former South Carolina senator, Supreme Court justice, and Roosevelt's director of war mobilization. Burns had actually expected to be Roosevelt's running mate in 1944, and many thought he would have made a better choice than Truman. Now Truman offered him the top diplomatic post. Stettinius resigned on June 27, 1945, accepting instead the position of first United States ambassador to the United Nations. He had served as Secretary of State for barely 6 months under Truman. Burns was sworn in on July 3rd, becoming Truman's own choice to manage American foreign policy. Just 3 weeks after Stettinius departed, another major Roosevelt figure left the cabinet. Henry Morgenthau Jr. had served as Treasury Secretary since 1934, over 11 years at Roosevelt's right hand, longer than anyone except Harold Ickes and Francis Perkins. Morgenthau had been instrumental in financing the New Deal and managing the massive wartime budget.
He had chaired the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944, which established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. But Morgenthau had a problem with the new administration.
Morgenthau had developed what became known as the Morgenthau Plan, a controversial proposal to completely deindustrialize Germany after the war, essentially turning it into an agricultural nation. The plan was meant to prevent Germany from ever becoming a military threat. Roosevelt had initially supported it, but by early 1945 had backed away. Truman opposed the plan entirely, believing a strong Germany would be essential for European stability and as a bulwark against Soviet expansion. The disagreement came to a head when Morgenthau insisted on accompanying Truman to the Potsdam Conference in Germany. When Truman made clear he would not bring him, Morgenthau threatened to resign. Truman immediately accepted the resignation on July 5, 1945, effective July 21st. Years later, Truman would speak harshly of Morgenthau, but at the time, the departure was officially described as a dignified parting. Morgenthau had served his country for over a decade, but his vision for post-war policy simply didn't align with Truman's. Around the same time, two other Roosevelt cabinet members quietly departed. Frances Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, and the first woman ever to hold a cabinet position, had been with Roosevelt from the very beginning in 1933. She had championed the Social Security Act, minimum wage laws, and the Fair Labor Standards Act. She was only one of two cabinet members, along with Harold Ickes, to serve Roosevelt's entire 12 years.
But Perkins was exhausted. She had accomplished an extraordinary amount and felt she had done what she could. She submitted her resignation in May, and Truman accepted it graciously on May 23, effective June 30, 1945. Though their time working together was brief, Truman praised her immense contributions to American workers. Perkins would later serve on the Civil Service Commission, but her days as a cabinet secretary were over. Frank Walker, the Postmaster General, also left in the summer of 1945. He had served since 1940 and oversaw one of the government's largest operations. He resigned effective June 30th, citing personal reasons. Truman replaced him with Robert Hannigan, who had been instrumental in securing Truman the vice presidential nomination in 1944. This was a clear sign of the new order. Truman was bringing in his own political allies.
The most dramatic cabinet departure came in February 1946. Harold Ickes had been Secretary of the Interior since 1933, nearly 13 years, the longest-serving cabinet member in Washington at that time. Known as Honest Harold, Ickes was a progressive champion of conservation, civil rights, and clean government. He had desegregated the Interior Department, arranged Marian Anderson's famous concert at the Lincoln Memorial, and managed billions in public works funds without a hint of corruption. He was also famously prickly and opinionated. Roosevelt had tolerated Ickes' temperament because he valued his integrity and effectiveness. Truman found him more difficult. The breaking point came when Truman nominated Edwin Powley, a wealthy California oil executive, to be Undersecretary of the Navy. Ickes was furious. During Powley's confirmation hearings, Ickes testified that Powley had lobbied against federal control of oil-rich offshore lands and suggested that campaign contributions could be raised if Ickes dropped his fight over these tide lands. Ickes essentially accused Powley of influence peddling. When Truman defended Powley and suggested that Ickes' memory might be faulty, Ickes exploded. He wrote a blistering 2,000-word resignation letter that began, "I don't care to stay in an administration where I am expected to commit perjury for the sake of the party." He added, "I do not have a reputation for dealing recklessly with the truth." Truman accepted the resignation immediately and gave Ickes just 3 days to vacate his office. It was February 14, 1946. A principled man to the end, Ickes held a press conference and told reporters exactly what had happened. It was a messy public break, the kind Truman generally tried to avoid, but one that demonstrated the different political cultures of the Roosevelt and Truman administrations. The most politically explosive firing came in September 1946. Henry Wallace had been Roosevelt's vice president from 1941 to 1945, before being replaced by Truman on the ticket. Roosevelt had consoled Wallace by making him Secretary of Commerce in March 1945. Wallace was brilliant but eccentric, an agricultural scientist who had developed high-yield corn, and a progressive visionary who championed the century of the common man. But Wallace's views on the Soviet Union increasingly alarmed Truman.
By mid-1946, the wartime alliance with Stalin was collapsing. Churchill had delivered his Iron Curtain speech. Tensions were rising over Eastern Europe, Iran, and Greece. Truman and his advisors were moving toward a harder line against Soviet expansion. Wallace disagreed fundamentally. He believed that Truman's policies were too confrontational and risked provoking another world war. On September 12, 1946, Wallace gave a speech at Madison Square Garden calling for peaceful coexistence with the Soviet Union. He suggested that America had no more business in Eastern European political affairs than Russia had in Latin America. The speech created an uproar. Republicans and many Democrats denounced it. Secretary of State Burns, who was in Paris negotiating with the Soviets, was furious. It undermined his position and confused foreign governments about what American policy actually was. Newspapers reported that Truman had approved the speech in advance, which made matters worse. Truman initially tried to defend Wallace, but the political pressure became unbearable. On September 20th, just 8 days after the speech, Truman called Wallace and asked for his resignation. Wallace complied graciously, but the damage was done. The firing demonstrated that Truman would not tolerate cabinet members who publicly disagreed with his foreign policy, no matter how prominent they were.
By the end of 1946, only one Roosevelt appointee remained in the cabinet: James Forrestal, the Secretary of the Navy. Forrestal had become Navy Secretary in May 1944, after the death of Frank Knox. Unlike many Roosevelt appointees, Forrestal was not a political figure, but a brilliant Wall Street financier who had proven himself an exceptional administrator during the war. He had managed the Navy's vast industrial mobilization, built the largest fleet in history, and visited battlefields across the Pacific. Forrestal stayed because Truman respected his competence and because the Navy needed continuity during the challenging post-war demobilization. In 1947, when Truman created the new Department of Defense and merged the War and Navy departments, he appointed Forrestal as the first Secretary of Defense. Forrestal would serve in that role until March 1949, when mounting disagreements with Truman over defense budgets and policy, combined with Forrestal's deteriorating mental health, led to his resignation. By then, nearly 4 years after Roosevelt's death, Forrestal was the last connection to FDR's wartime cabinet. His departure closed that chapter entirely.
So why did Truman feel compelled to replace Roosevelt's entire team? The reasons were complex and varied by individual, but several themes emerge. First, Truman needed people who were loyal to him, not to Roosevelt's memory. He couldn't lead effectively while being constantly compared to his predecessor or having cabinet members question his judgment based on what Roosevelt would have done. Second, Truman had different priorities and policies. Roosevelt had built his cabinet for depression and war. Truman needed a team for peace, reconstruction, and the emerging Cold War. On issues like Germany's future, relations with the Soviet Union, and domestic economic policy, Truman's views often differed from Roosevelt's, and he needed advisors who shared his perspective. Third, some Roosevelt appointees were simply exhausted. 12 years of depression and war had taken a toll. Perkins, Morgenthau, and others were ready to move on. Fourth, Truman wanted his own people, friends and political allies he had worked with in the Senate. This was natural and practical. A president needs advisors he can trust completely, people who understand his thinking and will be candid with him. Roosevelt's people had been chosen for Roosevelt's personality and methods. Truman needed people suited to his own style.
Finally, there was an element of political survival. Truman had been thrust into the presidency without preparation. He lacked Roosevelt's political skills, charisma, and national stature. Many in Washington initially viewed him as a temporary caretaker. To establish his own authority and govern effectively, Truman needed to build his own team and make clear that he, not Roosevelt's ghost, was now in charge. The transformation of the cabinet was part of that process. Looking back, Truman's systematic replacement of Roosevelt's cabinet was both necessary and successful. While it created some short-term turbulence, particularly with Ickes and Wallace, it allowed Truman to govern on his own terms. The new cabinet members he brought in, including George Marshall as Secretary of State and Dean Acheson later, helped Truman navigate some of the most consequential decisions in American history: the atomic bomb, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, the Berlin Airlift, the creation of NATO, and the Korean War. These were Truman's decisions, made with his team. By the end of his presidency in 1953, Truman had proven that he was far more than Roosevelt's accidental successor. He had established himself as a consequential president in his own right, one who made difficult decisions with conviction and reshaped American foreign policy for the Cold War era. The transformation of the cabinet that began in those first uncertain months of his presidency was a crucial step in that journey. The story of how Harry Truman stepped out of Franklin Roosevelt's shadow and became his own man. Thank you for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more.